So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on the role of emotions and cathartic effects in post-conflict heritage management. Actually, Sarina and I are co-convening this panel. So, Sarina Wakefield is lecturer in museum studies at the Leicester University School of Museum Studies in the UK. I'm a lecturer in cultural and creative industries at Sheffield University Management School. And we are delighted to have three panelists in our panel. That is Paul Newson, Associate Professor at the American University in Beirut. Ruth Young, Reader in Archaeology at the University of Leicester in the UK as well. And Ammar Azzouz from the Oxford University and Essex University. Welcome to this panel, very delighted to have you. We are planning to have three paper presentations first. Sarina and I are going to present our work in progress, and Sarina is going to summarize and theorize cathartic effects in post-destruction, post-crisis heritage management. I'm going to talk about methodology a bit. Then Ruth and Paul are going to present their paper, and then Ammar is presenting his paper. And afterwards, we have an overall Q&A session and about 30 minutes for debate. And we're aiming to use this panel to ask questions, to raise up questions rather than providing answers, raising kind of provocative questions as well, because we're dealing with emotions and cathartic effects. So we are hoping to have a very lively debate among us and with all of you. Thank you very much. Sarina, the floor is yours. You start.
Thanks, Annette. I'd just like to say thank you to Noor for organising the conference and for inviting us to Qatar. I think we're all delighted to be here. So our paper leads on, I think, quite nicely from the previous session, because we kind of, we want to bring the focus back around to communities and heritage practitioners, but also the emotionalities around cultural heritage. So the Middle East and North Africa region has seen significant transformations and reconfigurations in recent years, particularly in relation to the construction and destruction of cultural heritage. Analyses of cultural practices and processes within the MENA region have primarily focused on state-led formations at local, national and transnational levels. This working paper and our fellow panellists challenge these hegemonic processes by calling for a more people-centred and emotionally grounded post-conflict framework. This paper presents our project, Catharsis Heritage, which examines the role of emotion in post-conflict cultural heritage settings and how we might theorise and bring into action a socio-emotional heritage approach. Our aim today is to discuss our emerging work as a testbed for the next stage of our project. In this paper, we discuss the need to understand heritage as a cathartic process, a process that is entangled with deeply felt experiences of loss in post-conflict settings. This paper seeks to provide a point of departure for discussions around how emotion and trauma are intertwined within processes of rebuilding and reconstruction, and the need to create emotionally responsive methodological approaches to post-crisis heritage. We seek to question how heritage can be used to better understand the ways in which communities, practitioners, and governmental actors are affected by the trauma and emotion within post-conflict settings, and the methodological frameworks that might be shaped to create a trauma-informed cathartic heritage approach. Through this paper and our panel, we aim to shed light on new empirical viewpoints and have the potential to make a significant impact within the field of post-conflict heritage. The role of heritage as a cathartic process is an underexplored line of inquiry. Our project aims to expand on recent studies examining the role of emotion in heritage making and identity building, and the opportunities for cultural heritage practice for community engagement, healing and reconciliation. Our aim is to conceptualise and understand emotion as an embodied and cathartic act in post-conflict heritage settings in the MENA region. Post-conflict reconstruction narratives have been dominated by endangerment discourses that prioritise the salvage and reconstruction of heritage, resulting in a future-orientated approach whereby safeguarding for the future becomes the dominant heritage narrative. The dual need to mitigate risk and safeguard for the future reinforces the role of the expert and prioritises Western European expertise. In some cases, this process can create new frameworks and processes of heritage, which reinforce the role of preservation techniques. The endangerment narrative is also used to reinforce the hegemonic role of international expertise and structures, such as the World Heritage List. The process of categorising heritage as in danger is inherently political and embeds heritage within contemporary issues around bilateral relations and state building. Furthermore, it serves to prioritise and authorise certain forms of heritage over others. This is an important point, as endangerment can result in the marginalisation of diasporic past in the process of loss and rebuilding. More recently, endangerment has been challenged within heritage studies. These arguments call for a broader recognition of heritage that creates space for new values and new narratives, a heritage that embraces new and constantly evolving forms. RICO has argued that heritage in post-disaster context takes on a preventative and pedagogical role that has the potential to be life-saving. Other arguments have focused on the role of disassembly, which occur through the severing of established relations between people, practices, places, and objects. Within the MENA region, as Manawar notes, post-conflict heritage activities are highly politicised processes with the potential to create spaces of, quote, alternative reinterpretation and even transformation, unquote. Emotions around loss, destruction and damage are experienced in complex and myriad ways, which are often heightened through the politics of post-conflict heritage and the power knowledge frameworks that come into play during the rebuilding process. Fluck and Wiggins have argued that it is not so much loss that is problematic, but how individuals, communities and societies choose to deal with that loss. Yet loss is understood in terms of practice, that is, the doing the work of heritage. However, this marginalises the emotional experience of losing aspects of individual and/or collective heritage, which we argue is central to our understanding of heritage in post-conflict settings in the MENA region. The potential cathartic and healing effects of rebuilding and transformation through an ongoing and collaborative socio-emotional heritage is therefore overlooked. In our developing research project, we propose that heritage operates as a cathartic process, recognising that both heritage actors and communities are engaged in emotion work through the processes that emerge within post-conflict settings. Our research aims to explore the entangled emotional engagements between heritage practitioners, NGOs, governments and communities, recognising that heritage plays a cathartic role in these contexts. Studies of art galleries and museums have highlighted their potential for community engagement, care, and health and well-being. Yet within heritage studies, the emotional role of cultural heritage and its cathartic dimensions remains unexplored. Catharsis was described by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle as the emotional purge of fear and pity aroused by tragedy. Aristotle is referring to the emotionality that comes from theatrical performance, not real-world tragedy. The plays, much like contemporary forms of communicative media, build emotion through a storyline that results in a cathartic release and healing. Whereas within the field of psychology and psychiatry, catharsis has been used as an explicit form of therapy. The American Psychological Association defines catharsis as the discharge of previously repressed effects connected to traumatic events that occurs when these events are brought back into consciousness and re-experienced. More generally, it can be described as the release of strong pent-up emotions. In moments of loss, individuals and communities often use religious rituals and/or mourning practices as cathartic acts that serve to promote healing. These rituals demonstrate the emotional and cognitive aspects of catharsis. Through the rituals of mourning, individuals process their emotions and gain closure through ceremonies such as funerals. The effects of loss are felt in many ways. As Holtorf notes, loss is often experienced as a collective act that emerges as part of national identity making. Arguably, these acts are political due to their nation-building implications, particularly where that loss is linked to governmentality and state. Loss is also transvocal and culturally specific. People grieve and mourn various types of losses in their lives in very specific and very personal ways. Post-conflict settings are therefore emotion-generating situations where feelings of loss, grief, anger, regrowth, and so on are experienced through emotional and bodily experiences. Considering the socio-emotional role of heritage allows us to think about how researchers and practitioners experience and participate in different forms of loss, and how those losses are experienced and embodied through heritage forms and practices. In this sense, heritage becomes an intimate experience, where private and deeply personal experiences are shared through the processes surrounding post-conflict reconstruction. We propose that by understanding the cathartic role of heritage, that we can begin to understand community needs and create a more human-centred approach. In addition, this research aims to shed light on the emotional labour of heritage researchers and practitioners. In doing so, our research aims to situate the role that emotional labour plays within the heritage sector when living within and working in post-conflict and destruction settings. Dix and Swift posit that emotional labour requires a worker to produce an emotional state in another person, while at the same time managing one's own emotions. Emotional labour therefore takes skill, which is implicated through predefined notions of expertise, which are assumed to sit inherently within the skills base of heritage experts and aid workers. However, communities, through their embedded knowledge and experiences, are involved in the emotional labour when participating in heritage salvage and reconstruction processes. We suggest that heritage in post-conflict contexts is imbued with an emotional labour that is carried and shared at varying scales by local communities as well as by local and international heritage practitioners. Reconstruction contexts affect communities and heritage workers through the emotionally charged process of working through and with loss, destruction and damage. Cathartic heritage in this sense recognises the multiple and layered experiences of loss that are felt individually and collectively. Heritage should be seen as an embodied experience that affects heritage practitioners, communities and governmental actors. It also warns us of the negative effects that international heritage workers may bring to communities, since Western heritage practitioners or researchers may be seen as parachuting in to explore the emotions and loss of residents. Ultimately, we propose the need to move towards a more people-centred understanding of post-conflict heritage in the MENA region, a heritage that accounts for the ways in which individuals and communities experience and feel, and how these emotions are attached to the processes of rebuilding in post-conflict settings. Annette is now going to briefly outline the key methodological issues that we have identified, which we hope to discuss further with our panellists and all delegates during our discussion.
To give you some sort of context about our project in progress, we are taking Beirut's cultural heritage as a case study to examine response to the explosion in 2020 and the destruction of residential homes and cultural heritage. And as Sarina outlined, we are currently in the middle of developing a methodological framework shaped to create an emotion-centered and trauma-informed heritage approach that understands emotion as an embodied and potentially cathartic act in the context of local engagement, resilience building and healing in post-conflict heritage settings. So key stakeholders we have identified as central to our research include individual residents as well as residents that see themselves as members of a local community or have been engaged at various levels in local community and neighborhood initiatives and networks. We aim at approaching long-term residents as well as younger generations living in Beirut or considering to emigrate from Beirut. We might contact other local and international residents as well, for example, migrant workers, which might be particularly vulnerable due to various reasons, but are often overlooked as local communities. We further consider the wider ecosystem of institutional and non-institutional actors, for example, local initiatives in Beirut built in response to the blast, local and international NGOs, or small local businesses in the wider creative industries, for example. A particular group of stakeholders are property developers, urging long-term residents to leave their damaged houses and move into modern apartments in the suburbs. Rather than considering them as participants or key participants in our research, we are interested in the effects that business practices such as these might have on residents and communities in the short and long run. Another stakeholder group are diasporic communities, the complex involvement of which in heritage practices are rather under-addressed in the literature. Diasporic citizens or communities may have emotional connections to local cultural heritage stemming from childhood memories or kind of inherited nostalgia from their migrating families, possibly over several generations, to be explored against the backdrop of multi-local diasporic contexts in post-migrant and post-diasporic societies across the globe. A fourth group worth considering are influencers with or without diasporic connections to the respective heritage at stake. How might emotions of local as well as diasporic stakeholders be shaped by influencer activity and potentially amplified through social media dynamics, fueled or instrumentalized by multi-local political debate, heritage and tourism industries, tourism policies, cultural diplomacy, etc. Another significant group of stakeholders are cultural heritage professionals and arts practitioners living and working in Beirut and beyond. Since both individual art practitioners and heritage organizations are often locally embedded but also globally connected, traveling and working between Beirut and abroad, we expect them to contribute a very particular perspective on diasporic dynamics and in-betweenness in post-conflict heritage practice. Key challenges we anticipate include methodological issues, risk assessment, and our own role as researchers. We consider a range of qualitative methods such as narrative, inquiry, ethnography, and arts-based research. Methods we find particularly useful to assess emotion-related, uncertain, untold, and potentially cathartic response and heritage practices in post-conflict settings. Since these methods place people, personal experiences, everyday experiences, and small stories at the center, they might help illustrate intersections between the personal and the political, the self and society. Not only can such methods help us tackle bias, divergent experiences and narratives, and power imbalances within the research context, given that we consider a competing variety of local and diasporic stakeholders across ecosystems, but methods such as ethnography allow us to consider and reflect our own experiences as researchers as co-constitutive elements of the research process and outcome in collaboration with other participants. Arts-based research seems particularly suitable to evoke, inspire, and spark emotions and other metacognitive experiences, allowing participants and researchers to explore the complexity and often paradox of lived experience and negotiate multiple viewpoints. More than that, arts-based methods can help us get participants engaged with their experiences, but also make research accessible to a wide range of audiences. Arts-based methods may enable us to reach audiences and get them engaged in the imaginative potential of cultural heritage, further contributing or not to the potentially cathartic effect of heritage practice in post-conflict settings. We consider risk assessment and ethical clearance as particularly challenging, given the range of stakeholders we identified and the qualitative methods we aim to employ. For this paper, I draw on the articles by Taylor Winfield, Vulnerable Research from 2022, and Virginia Dixon Smith and colleagues, Doing Sensitive Research from 2007. We find particularly helpful that the articles think together reflection on the research context and action during fieldwork. This not only encourages us to constantly self-reflect on our research, but allows us to stay flexible and adapt methodologies in real time. We build on Winfield's framework of 6 competencies for vulnerable research. The first of which is self-awareness, that is the understanding of our own assumptions and biases in regards to the research site and or participants. That is the stakeholders we identified as most crucial for our specific research questions and design. Dixon Smith and others remind us that we are entering the lives of others. Quoting from their research on researchers doing sensitive research, they emphasize that, quote, "It is so much more than just signing a form to say that they are willing to offer you information. They are actually allowing you into their lives. They are telling you personal information that might be quite hard, so you need to demonstrate a certain degree of discretion, of respect, of appreciation for what they are doing, and you need to make sure that you're aware of that," unquote. In conclusion, they argue that we as researchers should be open to a certain extent to share some aspects of our personal lives and experiences with our participants that we rely on and that we expect to talk about most personal and emotionally charged issues. To handle sensitive research topics and not upset individuals or groups of participants, we should clarify possible dimensions of vulnerability, including physical, psychological, spiritual, and or structural vulnerabilities, or intersections of these which might magnify and reinforce each other. With a participant-centered approach, the researcher generally trusts that the participants have the skills and ability to tell their own stories despite potential vulnerabilities. Such an approach acknowledges the participants as full individuals who own their stories, obviously. Winfield highlights that such an approach allows the researcher and the participant to collaborate effectively. Not only can the participants direct the pace and flow of the conversation, but the researcher can share with them their research interests, preliminary findings, conclusions, etc., so that the research process and purpose become clear and remain transparent and accessible to the participants throughout the process. Participants may also feel free to point to other stakeholders they consider important or helpful to clarify their points or highlight the matter further. More than that, a participant-centered approach enables communities to co-decide which research questions were most important to them to be explored, an approach that might minimize overt or covert exploitation by the researcher, and is also crucial when it comes to data management and publishing, for example, when it is planned to make findings available to a wider audience beyond academia, for example, through exhibitions, performances, or other arts-based methods, as planned with our research. In addition to getting access to research sites, getting access to potentially vulnerable participants might be a challenge too, given the oftentimes weak or dynamic public infrastructure in post-conflict heritage settings. Recognizing social context seems crucial to navigate power imbalances among participants, but also within the research setting. For example, research language might be misunderstood or misinterpreted, and academic jargon be perceived as impenetrable, inappropriate, patronizing, or intimidating. In conclusion, the entire research project might be at risk of being perceived as exploitative and ignorant in regards to the participants' or community's needs and expectations. Paying attention to traumatic experiences by participants, researchers should think carefully about their research design, for example, about questionnaire design, the phrasing of questions, the order in which to ask questions, and any verbal or non-verbal clues participants might have. One of the biggest challenges is probably what might be called an element of surprise during interviews or conversations. What should be done when vulnerable participants shared suicidal thoughts, abuse, trauma, etc. with us? What if traumatic experiences are a part of the research topic, which is quite likely if we consider heritage practices as potentially cathartic? What if our research triggers trauma? What if by addressing emotional response to traumatic experiences, we put ideas into participants' heads? What if participants talk about thoughts or plans we consider inappropriate, dangerous for themselves or others? or unethical. While it seems hard to anticipate surprise responses by participants, we should certainly anticipate our own response to surprise during research. We could, for example, highlight the voluntary nature of the participation and suggest breakouts at any stage of the research process. Taking a break from the interview would allow us to address the surprise issue outside the direct research setting. We might point to a helpline where participants can find mental health support and then redirect the interview back to the topic. Which leads us to our last section, the role of the researcher and the fifth competency for researchers. Researchers should acknowledge their own professional limits. While there are no legal obligations since participation is voluntary, we might clarify in advance that we are no therapists. Instead, we might collaborate with mental health experts throughout the data collection process and beyond. While the literature generally emphasizes the vulnerability of participants, we need to acknowledge that research in post-conflict heritage settings might have an impact on researchers too. Not only is it essential to keep clear boundaries between researcher and participant, but researchers need to constantly reflect themselves, their academic role, and their resilience and well-being throughout the research process too. In conclusion, rather than seeing the risk assessment and ethical clearance process as a technical exercise, we should embrace our reflection of discomfort as a part of the research process. Drawing on Wakefield, we acknowledge that such a research approach is time-consuming and slow, since one might need to improvise and constantly adapt methodologies during the research process. With this panel and across various methods employed, we aim to discuss challenges and risks, but also mistakes or failures that may help us tackle challenges encountered in post-conflict heritage research. Thank you. And actually, please welcome our next speakers. That is Ruth and Paul. You find your... Ooh.
Don't touch anything. Never let me be in charge of technical things. Yeah, Newson young, that's it. Oh, there would have been cries all round, wouldn't there, if I'd done that? Yes, that's it. Thank you. And forward is arrow keys?
Yeah, the bottom arrow.
Bottom arrow. Brilliant.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe try keep them on. Please.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, and on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Paul Newson, it's great to be here, and we'd like to start by thanking the sponsors of the conference, and also giving our thanks to Dr. Noor Manawar and Zinat Hassan and their excellent team for organising the conference, and it's just brilliant to be here. Now, I want to begin this presentation by saying that we fully believe that community engagement with archaeological heritage is incredibly important in post-conflict situations. And although we are using this presentation as an opportunity to raise issues about community engagement that we hope will lead to some discussion, we do want to stress that we do this because we think that it is so important that we are all thinking critically, that we are being reflexive and should consider carefully the issues around how we work with communities and why. So over the last 20 to 30 years, in Europe and North America, community archaeology projects and programs have proliferated. And there are now several journals devoted to community and public archaeology, and of course many books on the subject that are very interesting and insightful. Archaeology and archaeological heritage community projects are good things. However, they are not simple fixes. They are not an easy way to help with social rifts and problems in any country or region, certainly not in post-conflict situations. Although we all know the power and potential of archaeology and heritage to help bring post-conflict communities together and to help them to rebuild, community engagement takes time and effort. So what does community actually mean? Well, in Europe, the origins of the concept of community lie with 19th century sociologists such as Ferdinand Tönnies and Emil Durkheim, where community was something for them based in rural life, with traditional values. And this resulted in the early ideas around community being simultaneously something that was positive, because traditional, of course, is almost shorthand for wholesome and good, while also being a bit negative, because rural is somewhat unsophisticated, and the traditional can also be backward-looking. Today, the concept of community is used in many different contexts in public life, but defining community remains incredibly difficult. And the sociologist George Hillary, in 1955, identified more than 90 different definitions of community, which gives, I think, an indication of just how widespread in use, yet difficult to pin down this concept actually is. When the concept of community is used by those in power, which includes, of course, archaeologists and heritage professionals, it can be a means of defining people and groups, but it could also become a means of dividing people and groups. An uncritical, essentializing use of the concepts of community and communities can result in considerable misrepresentation or even discrimination, as found by the sociologist Brian Allen in his work on race and ethnicity. And scholars like Allen are very clear that community is a powerful concept that can be misused with serious social consequences, and therefore we must be reflexive when thinking, writing, and working with communities. Also, a community is not a static bounded group, and it is always continually changing and reconstituting itself. In post-conflict areas, communities may well be fractured, and indeed many people may have been forced to leave their home or city or even country. As Noor Monawar and James Simmons demonstrated in a recent article about Aleppo and heritage, communities can be at a considerable distance from their heritage. Well, we recognise that community is a very difficult term to capture definitively, but in order to think through some issues around post-conflict community engagement, a definition of some kind is needed as a starting point, and the meaning of community is something that should be discussed carefully by those who aim to work with communities as part of an archaeological heritage project. There has been a major shift in the last 30 years in archaeology and heritage values, including a move away from the stewardship model of heritage that has its basis in the antiquarianism of the 19th century and was indeed reified by UNESCO in the post-war period. Alongside this has been increasing challenges to the idea of official heritage and its custodianship by the expert voice. And this has allowed the recognition that heritage and archaeology are for people, that is, the wider public in general and specific communities in particular. And this change in approach has also freed archaeologists and heritage professionals and allowed them to recognize that their knowledge of a site, their interpretations of a site, are not and should not be the only ones that are of value and significance. Being open and inclusive brings with it many benefits and opportunities that far outweigh the protection of specialized skills and knowledge. And we should also be questioning who sites are for, what and whose knowledge should be recognized, and who should have ownership of sites, and how sites should be presented. The rise of post-colonial frameworks and theories, for example, have insisted that we all reflect very carefully on who our work is for and who benefits from our work, as well as how we approach it. And the recognition that archaeologies of the everyday and of the recent past have great value has also allowed archaeology and archaeological heritage to be much more accessible to non-specialists. Post-conflict situations have many challenges. The conditions in a post-conflict region are likely to work against the sort of things that are needed for effective community engagement. In a situation where people have many pressing concerns, archaeology and heritage may well be a luxury they cannot afford. And it is also likely that reconstruction of heritage is going to be the most pressing need, is going to be the most pressing need for many areas, rather than the co-creation of a long-term archaeological project. Post-conflict situations are often also very pressured, with political and donor agendas requiring any heritage work to be done at speed. The Spirit of Mosul project is an example of this, where the desire to rebuild key monuments was seen as crucial in rebuilding society. Engaging effectively with any community takes a long time, often years, with the sort of interactions that build trust and respect. And in the immediate aftermath of conflict, there is little space or time for such interactions between governments, foreign donors, other official groups, including archaeologists and heritage professionals, and communities. And as well as thinking carefully about what actually constitutes a community, a further issue that we feel needs critical consideration is that of community gatekeepers. Many communities have an appointed or self-appointed spokesperson who often also acts as the gatekeeper of that community. Gatekeepers can be an excellent source of information, a means of making wider contacts in a community, and are often very keen to promote the community they represent. They often also work tirelessly to ensure the community benefits in multiple ways from external interests. However, gatekeepers can also be self-serving and have their own agendas, which may stretch to manipulating members or parts of a community any outsider, for example, an archaeologist or other academic, can meet and engage with, or which issues are stressed and which are hidden. In post-conflict situations, a gatekeeper may be seen as a shortcut to the wider community they represent, and it may be convenient to work with them. But without taking the time to get to know the community, it may be that the gatekeeper is not representing or allowing access to all community members. And another question is, how do we reach hidden communities? How do we reach parts of communities or communities within communities that are not easily accessible? When we are thinking about all of the stresses and difficulties of post-conflict societies that may be at play. Now I'd just like to talk a little bit about heritage tourism in post-conflict situations. Although post-conflict circumstances make it highly unlikely that there will be an immediate surge in tourist numbers, taking advantage of this then gives us the space and time to think carefully through approaches to building or rebuilding a tourism industry. There may be pressure on governments to make decisions and even investment around tourism as a source of money and jobs and be seen to be doing this, and resisting such actions may be difficult or even impossible. International funding and international organizations may be involved, and this work from them may be conditional. Governments themselves may not be able to refuse, let alone communities, or challenge what is happening. Now, ideally, there should be transparency around any kind of funding or support for heritage tourism work, as indeed there should be for any kind of post-conflict reconstruction work, where conditions and ethical issues can be addressed. And what we are concerned about is the uncritical idea of heritage tourism as an economic panacea and as an automatically desirable outcome of community engagement with heritage. It is especially important to think searchingly and carefully about heritage tourism in post-conflict situations where people are vulnerable and often desperate for jobs and sources of money. In reality, tourists are unlikely to be flocking to a post-conflict region until some time has passed and security is assured. And because of this time lag, post-conflict situations offer the chance to think about alternative models of heritage tourism and economic activities to genuinely work on sustainable and environmentally friendly products and services that meet or shape the needs of visitors and of the communities. Now, in order to move beyond raising general issues and problems, we'd like to look now at some examples of post-conflict archaeological heritage work where community engagement has been foregrounded. Two of these examples, the first and the third from the literature, and the middle one from our own work. And while each example is of course different, there are some overarching themes that occur and also some foundations for successful community engagement that are similar in many cases. And our first example is the archaeological work at Tel Mosen or Urkesh in northeastern Syria, which has been carried out for more than 30 years by a team from the International Institute for Mesopotamian Area Studies in conjunction with the Syrian Department of Antiquities. Alongside the excavation, recording and preservation of the site itself, the project team, led by Federico Boccalati, has committed to long-term community engagement. Various things have been important in working with the community, and these include taking the time to build effective networks, not just with local communities themselves, but with government departments, NGOs, both Syrian and international, civil society organizations, universities and schools. Now, funding for this project has also been critical, much of it coming from international sources, and this has allowed the project to be proactive and provide resources that the community had decided were priorities. For example, working with young men around stimulating employment in the area. Also important was alignment between the community project ambitions and political aims. Bukulati had strong relations with the government and key national agencies and found his plans were in harmony with the national cultural vision and policies to develop the area. And although he stressed that he wanted to enact change through community engagement rather than by imposing government plans, there are always power dynamics at play, but reflexive approaches can help mitigate imbalances. The Mozan project has been about a long-term commitment to bring communities together, offering them new and different ways to meet and work together, and, as Bukulati said, to become active agents in their communities, resisting terrorist groups, developing resilience, and building shared understanding. Bukulati has remained in contact with community members throughout the war and is confident that they will be doing their utmost to protect the site from sources of damage, which he believes include weathering as much as from conflict. Mozan is an example of long-term community engagement pre-war, which has continued through war, despite the many problems around communication, the sending of funds to Mozan, and of course the terrible impact of war on the communities themselves. Because of this time depth and the sense of ownership that the project has engendered amongst the communities, it makes it much more likely that the communities will take on responsibility for looking after the site and helping to preserve it. And moving on to Lebanon, there is, of course, considerable pride and heritage, with major sites such as Baalbek and Tyre contributing to national identity in many ways. Our work in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon centres around Hosn Nihar, a Greco-Roman site that is now some distance from the nearest small model settlement. At the heart of Hosn Nihar is a large Roman temple, partially affected by earthquakes, though the significant standing architectural remains have not been substantially damaged since they were first recorded in the 19th century. However, the surrounding contemporary village structures have all been extensively damaged, many through episodes of building and looting during the Civil War, and some through more recent agricultural encroachment and illegal digging. Hosn Nihar is in part a community resource, as it is a family picnic spot, a place to drive to, and a setting for hunting and hiking. However, it is not thought of by the general population as heritage in the same way that other contemporary sites along the stretch of the Bekaa Valley are. This is, at least in part, due to the considered way in which the site is presented and managed by the Department of Antiquities. Hosn Nihar is presented as a picturesque ruin, an indelible part of natural landscape. It lacks a high boundary wall, it lacks an admission ticket, and there are no maintained gardens. And without these official signifiers of a protected heritage site, it is valued differently. There is also the pervasive view that real archaeological heritage is the grand, the monumental, and the elite, so the temple is safe from human interference, while the everyday and the unspectacular is not heritage, so former dwellings are fair game for casual destruction. Community engagement is also difficult when local people see the government as the keepers and protectors of heritage, yet also believe they are largely failing in that role. And Hosn Nihar is a good example, as it shows some of the tensions between communities and their ideas of heritage versus official ideas of heritage. Now, for our final discussion example, I'd like to refer to the work of Yusuf Kanju, the former director of the Aleppo National Museum. He made a number of interesting points about community engagement, both before and then during the war in Syria, that have implications for post-conflict heritage reconstruction. Kanju claims that many communities lack knowledge and resources needed to protect archaeology, and without both of these, a will to preserve and protect archaeological sites, government legislation alone cannot be fully effective. However, he also claims that a fundamental issue is that government policy for heritage in the form of the Syrian law of antiquities puts a great distance between people and heritage, with the result that heritage is viewed as belonging to the government or even the rest of the world, but not to local populations. Now, interestingly, Kanju makes the following claim about the fundamental ways in what heritage is and how it is transmitted in Syria and across other countries with Arab populations. Kanju says the Arab perspective that tangible heritage, place, is not as important as the intangible heritage, tradition and concepts, can be understood easily by visiting museums and archaeological sites in Syria and Arab countries. These are not considered a community priority, and visiting a site is not done in order to learn about its importance, but just for enjoyment. And Kanju backs this up with the museum figures, visitor figures shown here in the graph, claiming that foreign visitors always outnumber domestic ones, and that in 2009, the National Museum and domestic had 71 foreign to 21% domestic visitors. Now, this we think is a very interesting statement with many implications, though we suspect there's much more complexity to this, and something we would very much like to hear views on. If heritage is to be meaningful to communities, they need to feel that they have a stake in it. And the war has pushed people even further away from understanding, feeling, and any sense of ownership, according to Kanju and heritage, re-establishing that connection is key to peace building and rebuilding. So in this paper, we have aimed to highlight some of the issues around ideas of community involvement in post-conflict situations. Working with communities is clearly fundamental in any post-conflict archaeological heritage reconstruction effort, yet so many projects are still being funded by international donors and follow a top-down, expert-driven model. While this may be in part explained by need to move swiftly or to satisfy political optics, it may also be due to complexities around effective community engagement. Case studies show that building relationships of trust and respect between official institutions, including foreign archaeological teams and local communities, is a long-term commitment. In many post-conflict situations, there is pressure and haste which works against this. And it is also highly likely that in post-conflict scenarios where reconstruction projects are being prioritized and funded by governments and other agencies, that contacts will be made with community gatekeepers who will then be the conduits and controllers of information and access in both directions. In many cases, community gatekeepers may be highly effective for all community members, but this is not a given. And unless the officials working on a project are aware that there may be hidden community members or missing communities that they should be connecting with, many people may be cut off from their heritage by the very projects that should be working with them. If any archaeological heritage project is serious about collaborating with post-conflict communities, possibly even aiming to co-create with communities, then there is a pressing need to develop strategies to ensure all voices are being heard. Communication and respect are of course vital, and the communication has to include active listening. It is also really important that all external partners, and particularly foreign archaeological teams, are aware that community engagement can be a cause of negative impacts as well as positive ones. But involving community in all aspects of archaeological heritage work is incredibly important, and it's vital even to the future of heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth and Paul. Please welcome Ammar Azzouz from the University of Oxford and the University of Essex on reconstructing Syria in exile.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here, and thanks a lot for the organizers for giving me the chance to present today. I hope you can be with me offline and not on your mobile phones, except if you are texting your mother urgently, or if you are taking a photo to put a post about this event on Twitter. I'm joking, you can do whatever. But I'm really grateful to be here today. I'm based in the UK. I'm one of the millions of Syrian refugees who live around the world. We are more than half of the population of this country has been displaced since 2011, so I'm one of these people. I'm residing in the UK. I never returned to my country since 2011. Before I start, I just want to ask if anyone has been to Syria before. Can you raise your hand? So, ooh, quite a lot of people. That's amazing. Incredible. So thanks for sharing that. This is my country. I usually put this map of geography, especially when I'm too far away from it for people who aren't familiar with the region. And yesterday flying to Doha was really emotional to see, like on an airplane that I see my city from so far away. I see the name of Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, and I'm unable to return or to visit for 12 years where my family still resides. So it's really amazing to be geographically close to my home country. So thank you so much, Qatar, for giving us the chance to be here, and also emotionally with the language, with the understanding. I'm really grateful to be here. What I'll be talking today about is two items. The first one, I will be presenting a little bit about the reconstructing of Syria in exile. So that's my main focus. And then the second part will be presenting around 10 minutes a film project that I have worked on. And to give you a glimpse of my work, I usually look at the destruction of people's homes. So I'm a little bit less interested in destruction of monumental heritage and ancient heritage sites, and more focused on the destruction of everyday spaces. I have a book coming on this subject called Domicide, or maybe to make it easier for the translator, maybe I would refer to it as Madhbahat al-Watan, or the killing of home. So domicide is from the word domus, home, and the word side, which is the killing of home, so similar to what we hear about suicide or genocide. It will be published in June 2023, and it has a foreword by Lise Duzait from the BBC, and endorsements by wonderful scholars, including Rosie Bshir from Harvard, who has written on Saudi Arabia, Lynn Meskel from Pennsylvania, who wrote A Future in Ruins, and Professor Khalid Fahmy from Tufts University, who also is a great scholar on the Middle East and North Africa. So my focus on three sections for this talk. The first one is about the emergence of tangible spaces of solidarity and support, and my positionality. As I said, I never returned to my country, so the question I'm trying to raise, what do Syrian diaspora create in terms of like spaces of togetherness and celebration of cultures? And I refer just to a few examples here. One of these examples is a festival that I volunteered with in the last year. It has been running for 5 years in Manchester by a charity called Rethink Rebuild Society. And this is a poster here about the festival. Why this festival has been so important since 2017 is because the Syrian war has turned Syrians into numbers, and very often we have been only associated with destruction and with misery and trauma. And what this festival does is really to give a different version of history, or a different story based on art and culture. So I just read a quote here from the founders of the festival, who say that the news from Syria and the sadness, death and misery that continues to pour out from the unrest must be juxtaposed against another vision of Syria, one that is filled with beauty, creativity, and rebirth. And this festival is a celebration of this hopeful, inspiring, and imaginative face of Syria and the Syrian people, and the rich contribution to the collective history of human expression. This was founded in 2017 in Manchester, and then it was followed up by another festival that was founded in London last year. It's called Saqaf, or the Syrian Arts and Culture Festival. And the organizers refer to the word Saqaf, which in Arabic means a ceiling or roof. And they say here in a quote that Saqaf is a word which is also used to represent the very limit of something. By drawing on these imaginaries, Saqaf sets out to embody multiple meanings. On one hand, the festival aims to bring people together under a shared roof, like we are actually today, where new connections and understandings can take shape. On the other hand, it acts as a provocation against the limits imposed on forms of creative expression that many Syrians have navigated. Saqaf aspires to be a creative platform where limits can be pushed and boundaries are broken. And I think in somehow like these festivals, they are not only excited for Syrians who are living in diaspora without being able to return. So as myself for over a decade. So it's a reconnection with our culture and past and heritage, but it's also like a way to introduce our own heritage and culture to different cultures and to integrate. So the audiences are really wide and different. You have like the Syrians who come to these events and they want to reconnect and stay to preserve the heritage and memory, and you have like people who aren't from the community but they want to know more and to stand in solidarity with Syrians. This was just an example I bought from a few weeks, actually a month ago, when the earthquake took place in Turkey and Syria, and because we don't have a Syrian embassy in the UK, and there was a collective sense of mourning and collective sense of grief, really. A small house was created, almost like a tent. I felt so emotional because it just reminded me of all the camps in Jordan. So there's a tent here in the bottom of the photo in the heart of London in Trafalgar Square. It was called the Syria House, and it was where actually many like politicians came, and the King's Charles came, and the Mayor of London came. And you can see on this historical monument, they projected the words "Stands with Syrians." So it was really, when we don't have a tangible space, it was also like an emotional moment to stand in solidarity. The second point I want to talk about briefly is the emergence of intangible platforms and digital platforms to preserve Syrian heritage and memory. And these are some of the photos from my own city, Homs, because I feel also when we see any conflict like what we see in Ukraine today, we only see destroyed buildings, but we don't know how the life looked like. So I always like to put like photos from before the war. And the question is, how do we remember, and how much do we remember, and how can we create spaces of digital archives and online platforms to protect this memory, which actually was beneficial to see the presentation earlier today about like what Qatar Library is doing in this effort. So there's a lot of, almost like with any trauma or struggle, there's an explosion of memory projects. The question of memory becomes so essential, and there are many platforms today, mainly led by Syrians and also like friends and allies who want to do something in response to the destruction. So I'm also doing some self-marketing about my own hand drawings. There are projects such as Al Jumhuriya platform, which publishes a lot of like writings by Syrian voices. There's Syria Untold, there's Al Bayt Collective, there's the Syria Archive, and the Memory of the Syrian Revolution. Why these projects, the tangible and intangible spaces, are so important? There are so many reasons, but some of them are preserving memory, shaping the future reconstruction. But then a question is it also to reclaim a narrative? And I just want to focus on this word briefly. This is like my city, where more than half of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed since 2011. And then somehow like Syria today is becoming one of these called as forgotten wars. As I always say, like our pain moved from the headline of the news into a footnote in history. And in this process of destruction, there's a process of rewriting history, as Rosie Bashir says that erasure is not simply a countermeasure to making history, it is history. From hiding or burying the documents and artifacts to the demolition of monuments and buildings, destruction is a requisite for the making of history and of the state. So the question I always ask and wonder in any conflict, who is telling the story and who is being heard? And I refer to the quote by Rebecca Solnit, who says in her book, Hope in the Dark, which is a very powerful one sentence only. And she says here, every conflict is in part a battle over the story we tell, or who tells and who is heard. And in somehow, like even until today, more than 12 years into the war in Syria, there's so much struggles on how many times do you hear a story about Syria without having Syrians? How many times you hear about a Syrian project without engagement with Syrians? So it's really painful, and that's what made me work on this paper, which I was invited to write it by Lynn Muskell, who I called it Our Pain, Their Heritage Project, or the translation is وجعنا هو تراثهم الثقافي أو مشروعهم الثقافي. So Our Pain, Their Heritage Project, and in somehow looking at the question how any trauma or misery or struggle can be turned into an industry or a business for people to make money out of our pain. And I always like I hope that you find some important discussions in this paper. There's always a question of decolonization, the curriculum, decolonization of knowledge, but really who has the right to write the story, who has the right to write history. And I criticize many people in this paper, and yet they still invite me to talk to them about my work. So I'm happy that at least trying to open uncomfortable question is so important in any context of conflict, and as you mentioned, in vulnerable settings. So I hope you find it of importance. The last point I want to say before we move to the film for a few minutes, the word reconstruction. It's a buzzword, like many words, like sustainability. They are big, giant words, but the question is, what is the in the reconstruction? What are we reconstructing? Is it a reconstruction of identity or memory or a community or the physical or the intangible? I tried in this presentation to look at the intangible and the tangible, but in the film that I have created a few years ago, which I will be maybe deconstructing the word reconstruction throughout the film that you will be watching for 10 minutes. It includes interviews with academics and residents from academics from different parts of the world, and also residents from Syria and Iraq to talk about what reconstruction means for them. So in somehow it was also an effort to stretch different geographies. So people would be talking from Warsaw in Poland from after the Second World War into like the destruction in Damascus and Homs, to also like other places like Bosnia or Spain after the Civil War. So I hope it does work. If it doesn't work, then we can just chat. So I will present the film for maybe 10 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Cities don't lie. They reflect their communities in a way or another. Hom's nickname before 2011 was the mother of the poor. It wasn't attractive to big investors or tourists. It didn't witness important events and rarely hosted VIP visits, but it was a poor resident-friendly city. You didn't need to be rich to live and enjoy life inside it. With few landmarks, thriving center, calm but vibrant neighborhoods, life in Homs was as simple and peaceful as could be. War had carved deep scars in the city. Healing process will take quite a long time. The city which was once the mother of the poor will proceed to be the mother of the poorest. Now the city will speak out again about its people. It will tell you that wealthy and skilled residents had left the site, while poor and low-income ones had to stay, and the poorest had to come back to reoccupy their partially destroyed buildings.
After we left our house, we heard that it was destroyed. So we left to my grandmother's house, then we left to my uncle's house, then we left to some long distance relatives. Then we went back to Homs, then we rented a house, then we had to leave for another house because of the bombing. So we changed 10 houses in 8 years. Then in 2016, I think 20 people were living there. People were gathering themselves. The neighbors were talking that if we go all of us back at the same time, we would feel like home again. So they were encouraging each other to go back and encouraging that the shops to open so they would feel that the life is back there. So it was slow, but eventually it happened. Even now, because half the city is closed, the areas, the roads, everything, it's completely new. Even me, I don't feel like this is the city that I used to live in. It's completely different. Even the people who are living there, it's very different. So I don't feel that this is the city which I grew in.
The reconstruction and approaches to reconstruction, again, this is a word that gets used a lot. But if you unpack it a little bit, what goes into the reconstruction? One thing that goes into it is rebuilding. Another thing that goes into it is just revisioning a society, both its past and its future. There's a recodification of values, of moral values, of what it's right or not right to do, what it's acceptable or is not acceptable. So there are a lot of re's that go into reconstruction. One of the re's is rewriting the past. And that's always a selective process. You see that in other reconstruction projects where there's a kind of à la carte choice. You're presented with a menu in which bits of the past you're going to echo in the styles that you choose to rebuild in, which bits of the past you're going to focus on reconstructing those sites as they were, and which ones you're going to say, oh, this is a great opportunity to modernize. But in so many of the reconstruction projects that you see today, especially those guided by the international community, there seems to be this kind of sense of ambition. I don't know if it's an ambition, but wanting to pretend that the war never happened, to go back to a pre-war stage as if the war hadn't happened at all. You can't do that. You can't just kind of lift up the rug and sweep all the mess of the war under it and cover it up and pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't go away. And the problem with that attitude towards reconstruction is that very often the reconstruction ends up happening actually on the basis of the divides created by the war.
It has to come from the people themselves. With every reconstruction plans come through, they have to reflect us as people, and they need to look like us, to look like our history. I don't think that bringing something completely new or completely modern is what we need. There might be some potential to improve some areas of infrastructure like electricity or water, but the appearance of the buildings need to reflect us and need to come from the people. And if I'd see, for example, a completely modern building in the center of Damascus, I think it would be like exile in your own city.
The difficult question about kind of post-conflict reconstruction is...
Cool. So I think I would just stop it here, just for the cautiousness of time. Yeah, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, Ammar, for this very interesting paper, and again, Paul and Ruth as well, Sarina, for the papers. We plan to have a Q&A session and a discussion right now. So, but let's start with any questions, any issues that you would like to raise from the audience, from the delegates.
How many hours do we have actually? Because this is a very sensitive issue, and wherever we choose to start, we will never end up. But actually, if we look at the cultural heritage, if we look at the stones, if we look at whatever, they are just rubbish, they are stones. This is not what we are looking for. We are looking for how the people see them. So the question is, who owns the past? If we start in this direction, maybe we'll be happy at the end of this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for fascinating presentations. Just one question for Ammar, or maybe to build on your new book on domicide. I wonder how much is the focus on the physical destruction, but also the idea of home, you know, for Syrians that have left home multiple times. How are you sort of conceptualizing domicide and what that means? And how do you go about rebuilding? Rebuilding it physically, but rebuilding it mentally.
Thank you very much for the really interesting papers. I have I must admit, a little provocative question to the paper, about community archaeology. Sorry, I forgot your name. Can you? I'm Ruth. Ruth, yes, Ruth. This is why I was confused. Yeah. You talked about Tel Mozan, which is located in northern Syria. I guess is part controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. And you talked about the long history of the site and the fact that that particular excavations, like many others in that area, have been European-run excavation for a very long time before the war. Now, I would push your argument a little further by asking you, can we really consider this type of heritage management in the long term a model for heritage preservation and heritage reconstruction? I mean, I have been working in Syria in the 90s, and I've seen these sites, and I really have serious doubts that what they did was heritage preservation and that they preserved what they were interested in.
Well, I think you're right. I don't think it is a model for long-term preservation, and I certainly don't think that that's what we're suggesting. In the paper that we've just given and put together, we were looking for examples of community projects from the Middle East, and the Mozan one is one that came up as a sort of a pre-war project where the director was saying, you know, things have been successful because of certain factors, and that is what we were trying to pull out. Now, I don't think that either of us would argue that that kind of colonial approach is the way we should be going moving forward. Absolutely not. I mean, you know, we have discussed lots of issues around the very presence of foreign archaeological teams, and I think that's something that is incredibly challenging. There aren't any simple answers there, you know, and it comes back to questions like who owns the past. There are certainly no simple answers here. But what was interesting about that project is that there were certain pre-war, certainly certain things that came out of it around communication that are echoed in other community-based projects that have some legs. Would you like to add to that, Paul? No. So no, we're not suggesting for a minute that that's the kind of long-term model any of us should be looking at with community engagement. And indeed, what we wanted to do with this paper was say, hey, look, here are some examples of community engagement. Are they successful? What makes success? How do we talk about community engagement and engagement with communities as successful? And we think it's probably very contingent on individual circumstances, different communities, different, you know, who's involved? Is it the government? And one of the interesting things about the Mozan project, I think, which when you read about it certainly comes through, is that it was also top-down, and that the director, Bukalati, has lots of contacts with NGOs, with government actors, and that really helped make it a success. And he was very open about this. So it's still top-down, but you can ameliorate some of that by being reflexive and really thinking through what you're doing. But it's still a top-down way of approaching community engagement, that's for sure. But he was clear it was successful because he had these kind of networks and connections, which quite often rural communities will not have. They will not have these connections in place. So yeah, it's very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Is really important, and Like in a pre-2011 time, at least in my case in Syria, I feel we have been given like a version of history that it's very one-sided and it's very much like one narrative. And the minute like millions of Syrians have fled their country, they suddenly realize that there are so many different versions of history and so many different hidden stories. And everyone tells you, I feel I was like a minority. A woman with a headscarf who wants to remove it, she feels like she was oppressed. A man who was, let's say, like from a certain sectarian line, he feels like a minority. Or a small community from, let's say, Ismaili community or a Druze community, they feel like we were minorities. We didn't feel our history was celebrated. So in somehow these multiple versions of history, they have been hidden in somehow, and they haven't been communicated to celebrate differences, to communicate with each other. And in somehow, these projects that explode after 2011 in terms of like the emergence of new platforms and memory projects, they become in somehow spaces for telling new versions of history. And I think that's so essential to enable different voices, that it's this like any country, it's not like one voice, one history. And usually like the writing of history is essential in like defending like what to remember, how much to remember. And I think I do believe in like the power of art and culture to tell these stories. Yeah, so thank you so much for the great question. And there was also a question about is it the physical or the non-physical from Craig on my home project, on the book project. It's definitely what I tried to say in the book, that home for each of us, if you have a flat or a house or a villa or I don't know what people have, but like it's a space of safety and security and belonging and identity. And that space, like even when we leave it, we feel like it doesn't leave us, like we still feel nostalgic to that space. So it is actually the physical where we are living, but it can also be the metaphor of what is home for us. Is it our family or neighbors or body, or is it like the different elements? And in many times the home is also the connections. Like when I walk in a street in Homs, I would definitely say hello to many people and I will know the people, but when I came to the UK, I'm a complete stranger. So even losing the infrastructure of support around me is in itself like creating a sense of like estrangement or like disorientation. And I think, like you mentioned, the work on like how to rebuild the community after trauma. I think even trauma now in Syria with all the political situation, there is no public mourning for the grieving, and I think there's an enormous need for having like an individual and collective sense of mourning, that people feel that their injury has been heard and listened to, and they are moving across the different stages of grief as a person and also as a community.
Yes, thank you for very interesting and amazing presentations. But I think everyone knows the power of cultural heritage and what the effect of the cultural heritage to society, to our communities. So when we study the cultural heritage, we don't study the intangible or tangible things. We study the identity, we study our past experience of humanities. So I'm very interesting about how we can learn our people, our communities about this power of cultural heritage. I think we need to engage them to involve with us when we research about cultural heritage, not in the conflict area, but in the safety area too. In the conflict area, unfortunately, we have a bad experience with this. We lost many elements of our cultural heritage, but we need to learn other communities, other society, how we can preserve their cultural heritage in the peace time or in the conflict time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you so much for the presentations. Just 2 or 3 remarks that came to my mind while you were talking. 2 about international comparisons. That is, I remember, for instance, as you mentioned, surprise. A study that was made by archaeologists from Pennsylvania, which was about Mayan temples in Yucatan in post-conflict situation, as this was shortly after the end of the Zapatista rebellion. And their approach was very much, as you mentioned, people and place-based. And they were extremely surprised to encounter communities to which they were talking about heritage and the pyramids, and the answer was, we don't care. Because this is heritage, we perfectly know it, but it's not an heritage to which we relate. We relate to 19th century churches, we relate to other parts of heritage. It is important, but from an economic point of view. The second, when it comes to emotions, as you remember, the Church of Notre Dame was destroyed by a fire a few years ago in Paris, and this was also about appropriation. Just following the destruction of the church, you had an enormous amount of small donations that came in together for the rebuilding of the church. And it stopped in a matter of days as great fortunes came in. There were many social issues in France at the time, and it was seen as appropriating the trauma and the drama by the richest people in the country. With most of the people were ready to make these small donations that reached nearly €1 billion. But it stopped. And since you mentioned also data about museums in Damascus, I've worked a bit on museums in Cairo and Beirut also. So I might have some ideas about the frequentation and the way this is appropriated or not by locals or by diasporic people. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for 3 fascinating papers and presentations. I really enjoyed. It seems to me that there was something in common between 3 papers and also the last paper of the previous session that the lady was talking about, UNESCO's projects. It seems to me that in many cases, with few exceptions, big international projects or our strategies for international projects is driven by the World Heritage vision. And I don't necessarily mean those sites that are inscribed as World Heritage, but I mean the vision of having select landmarks that we have to invest on them and rebuild or reconstruct them after a conflict as a remedy or as a medicine for post-conflict situation or for a conflict situation. And the examples are not just in the Arab region. You can look at what happened to UNESCO's project for Buddha's statues in Afghanistan, or even Mostar Bridge in former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where these projects were presented as, okay, there was a conflict, let's invest on few landmarks, and we bring together people, and we say, okay, hey, you had a conflict, but let's focus on post-conflict situation, because rebuilding heritage, because there are positives in heritage, and by reconstructing them, we are able to bridge or forget about the conflicts. And that was something also in the documentary, Dacia from Cambridge. She was also saying that I think we shouldn't forget about or ignore, I don't want to say negative role of heritage, but heritage, as the gentleman said here, who owns the past, and part of the past is our problems, traumas, and challenges and questions about who we are. So heritage is also about that. Heritage is not just about positive role in post-conflict reconstruction. If we forget about that, and if we look at reconstruction project as just a remedy, a quick fix, I'm afraid maybe we find ourselves again in the same situation. And I also had a comment about why museums or why heritage is perceived more intangible in the region and why museums are not that welcoming, but maybe I can talk about that later.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hello. It's exactly this point I wanted to talk about. So also, thank you very much, all papers. Also very touching. Comparing with museums in Qatar, of course, which I'm quite familiar with the last periods, I think museums always, but not only in Qatar, also in Aleppo, actually, in Damascus, which I both know very well, and of course in Berlin, where I come from, is of course with these museums there's always two sides. Once you have the visitors, the tourists, and then you have the people. And for example, Berlin Museum, Pergamon Museum, mainly tourists, and I think the same in the British Museum and the Louvre and so on and so on. Here in Qatar, museums numbers rise when we have the big ships outside, 1,400 per day, which is nice for the numbers. But of course, it doesn't mean the local community. The local community is extremely important, and this is something which you don't see, for example, in Qatar museums from the outside very often. In fact, our main target group, the people here inside. So we have a whole department that does nothing else, bringing schools. So we have sleepovers, we have, treasure hunts, we have painting exhibitions. And I think I remember from Syria also schools were there, but Aleppo always was very empty unless there were tourist groups, obviously. I honestly hope and wish, I dream of this, in fact, that these museums in the future can become these local points for the community to meet, and for the young people, for the teenagers, I think there is so much potential which has never been adapted, also because museum life changed over the last years, and I think the UK is a forerunner in this because they have all these amazing community programs. I think they are in the world. They have so many, or the Netherlands, for example. So I think this can change, and with Qatar you can see it change, because in the beginning when the museum was built, no one knew what a museum was, because it was just a foreign thing. But now it's so busy. And it's not only busy with the tourist ships, it really is very busy with the local communities who also look at the exhibitions that target the region, and don't speak about something which is in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to come to an end, unfortunately, but lunch is awaiting. No, but just following up on what, thank you very much, Julia Gonella, for your comments. I stayed the past 10 years in Berlin as well before I joined Sheffield, so I know the Berlin case quite well. And Berlin is probably a very interesting case study in talking about the past, in talking about in talking about the very negative consequences of the past in the present. So I'd like to think about heritage as who owns the past. That is a question about who owns the present as well in the present discourse. And the future, obviously, then as well. What I take from this very interesting panel, thank you very much again for all your contributions, is seriously to look at maybe heritage as an outcome on the one hand, which tended to, or which I could read between the lines from your paper, UNESCO, etc., donors and donor expectations focusing on the outcome rather than the process. And we might need to look more on the process, on the social aspects that became very clear in your paper as well. So that is not process versus outcome, but maybe focus more on the process in the present and in the future. And the second part I found particularly interesting is the imaginative role of heritage and processes that you mentioned that we are interested in as well, arts-based methods and of research, using for research, but for the presentation and dissemination, not of outcomes and findings of research, but of research processes. And then the third one, maybe the role of the researcher that we need to probably reflect more critically on, especially in very emotional settings where you get involved yourself as an academic, so the academic perspective, bias, etc., but emotions involved as well. So thank you very much for your contributions, for your papers, for your contributions. Thank you.